Emma never imagined that a single missed period would be the thread unraveling her entire world. She had always been careful, meticulous even, with every detail of her life. Her planner was color-coded, her routines set like clockwork, and her relationships compartmentalized. But that morning, standing in front of the mirror, trembling hands clutching the test, two pink lines staring back at her, Emma felt the foundation of her carefully ordered world crumble beneath her. She wasn't just pregnant, she was terrified. There was supposed to be no overlap. The one night she'd been with Daniel, the man she'd worked so hard to keep buried in her past, was supposed to stay locked away like an old wound. Her relationship with Jason, her steady and dependable boyfriend, was moving forward. They'd just started looking at new apartments, discussing long-term plans. She'd buried the past for a reason. But now, with something growing inside her, and timelines that no longer fit, that night came crawling back to the surface. At first, she convinced herself it had to be Jason's. She wanted to believe it so badly that she nearly rewrote her own memory. But something about the way her body felt, different, heavier, faster, refused to let her rest. The days blurred into a haze of nausea and second-guessing. She booked the first available appointment with her OB/GYN, desperate not just for confirmation but for clarity. What she got, however, was confusion. "You're pregnant with twins," the doctor said, smiling gently as if delivering good news. "Fraternal, 2 separate sacs. Both are healthy." Twins? Emma hadn't even wrapped her mind around being pregnant with one. The drive home was a blur, her knuckles white around the steering wheel. Fraternal twins. 2 separate eggs. 2 possible fathers. The math landed in her lap like a ticking bomb. And for the first time in her life, Emma didn't know which future she was heading toward, or if either man had a place in it. She parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in silence as the rain began to tap softly against the windshield, like a clock counting down to the truth. Inside her, 2 lives were forming, and with them, a truth she wouldn't be able to hide for much longer. Emma had never been good at lying, especially not to Jason. That night, as they sat across from each other in the warm glow of their kitchen, he spoke about baby names with a level of excitement she hadn't seen in him before. His blue eyes lit up every time he mentioned the future. A future she wasn't sure belonged to him anymore. "I always liked the name Leo," he said, twirling a forkful of pasta without eating it. "Strong, simple. And if it's a girl, maybe Hannah?" She nodded slowly, her mouth dry, her own dinner untouched. The room felt too bright, too honest. Every corner held memories they'd built together. Photos from road trips, a painting they'd chosen on a rainy Sunday, the dog-eared book they both pretended to finish. Emma wanted so badly to lean into that comfort, to accept Jason's joy as her own, but the truth was pressing at her chest like a growing bruise. She'd read the medical articles, spent nights in anonymous online forums, and cried quietly into her pillow. It wasn't common, but it was possible. 2 separate acts of conception, days apart. 2 different men, 2 different genetic codes. Her babies could be living proof of a past she'd sworn to bury. As Jason reached across the table and held her hand, Emma wanted to freeze that moment forever, to live in a world where love and biology never collided. "Emma," he said softly, "I know this is scary, but we're in it together, no matter what." His voice cracked just enough to remind her how much he truly meant it, and that made it worse. She smiled weakly, squeezing his hand back, but said nothing. Inside, her silence grew heavier, because Jason didn't know the storm coming. He didn't know about the night she'd tried to forget. He didn't know about Daniel, and he certainly didn't know that only one of the twins might be his. After dinner, Emma excused herself, claiming fatigue, but really she just needed to fall apart somewhere private. In the bathroom, she pressed her forehead against the mirror and whispered to her reflection, "What have I done?" But the mirror, like her future, offered no answers. Just the reflection of a woman breaking in silence. The next morning, Emma called out from work, her voice barely audible over the phone. She sat by the window with a blanket draped over her shoulders, watching the sky shift from gray to an indifferent blue. Her mind churned with questions she couldn't speak aloud. What if one child looked like Jason and the other like Daniel? What if DNA tests confirmed what her instincts already feared? And what would she even do with that truth? She sipped her cold tea, untouched since sunrise, while her laptop glowed softly on the table in front of her. She had already read the forums again, searching for stories like hers, desperate for a guide, a roadmap, anything. Most ended in heartbreak, some in silence, a few in strength she wasn't sure she had. The guilt gnawed at her, growing larger than the babies inside her. This wasn't just about her mistake. It was about the ripple effect it would cause, the lives it would reshape, the hearts it might shatter. She opened a new tab in her browser and typed in Daniel's name. It had been months since they'd last spoken. That night they shared had been a fluke, born from unresolved feelings, a bottle of wine, and a moment of weakness. He was a chapter she thought she'd closed, but now her children might carry his blood. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should she call him? Would he even want to know? Was it selfish to drag him back into her life? Or cruel not to? Her phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "Thinking of you. Let's talk tonight. I love you." She stared at the screen, her vision blurring. He had no idea. No one did. Emma pressed her hand against her belly. 2 small heartbeats were growing inside her, and soon they'd need more than secrets to survive. She looked back out the window, the light shifting slightly on the glass. Somewhere out there, 2 men lived in different corners of her truth, and both were walking toward something they couldn't see coming. She would have to choose, not just between them, but between fear and courage, silence and honesty. And as she wrapped the blanket tighter, she realized her time to stay quiet was running out. Emma didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined her children asking her someday who their father was, and she had no idea how she would answer. By dawn, she had made her decision. She needed to talk to Daniel, not because she wanted to bring him back into her life, and certainly not because she missed him, but because the truth couldn't live in shadows forever. She found his contact still saved on her phone under his full name, like a professional she once worked with. Detached, neutral, a lie. Her thumb hovered over the screen before pressing call, and her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the ringing. On the 3rd ring, he answered, his voice groggy and low. "Emma?" Just hearing her name in his voice made everything more real. She hesitated, her mouth suddenly dry. "I need to talk to you," she said, carefully measured, like she was handling glass. "In person, it's important," he agreed without questioning, and they set a time to meet that afternoon at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Neutral ground, away from Jason's world and her own fragile safety net. The hours leading up to that meeting moved in slow motion. Emma sat in her car outside the cafe 15 minutes early, watching people pass by, sipping drinks and laughing like the world wasn't complicated. She envied them. She envied anyone who didn't have to deliver the kind of truth that could change a life. When Daniel finally arrived, his posture was the same, shoulders slightly hunched, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes always searching. He hadn't changed, and maybe that was the most painful part. He smiled when he saw her, a little unsure, and she managed a nod in return. They sat across from each other like 2 ghosts from a shared past. "So, what's going on?" he asked, his tone half curious, half worried. Emma took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant," she said. He blinked, the smile vanishing instantly. "And there's a chance one of the twins is yours." The words hit the table like a dropped glass. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Time stopped between them. And for the first time since she took that test, Emma wasn't the only one holding the secret. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, like he needed more space between himself and what she had just said. His jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something far more complex. Disbelief, fear, maybe even a flash of guilt. Emma watched his reaction in silence, every second stretching her nerves thinner. "You're serious?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, eyes fixed on her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. "Two separate sacs, fraternal twins. It's rare, but the doctor said it's possible. If the timing is right, which it is." Daniel let out a long, uneven breath and ran his fingers through his hair. "So what now?" It was a fair question, but it hit Emma like a stone, because she didn't have an answer. She didn't even know what she expected him to say. That he'd step up, run away, offer silence? She had come here hoping that speaking the truth would somehow make things clearer. Instead, it made everything heavier. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly, her voice defensive. I needed you to know. Because if one of them is yours, then one day they might want to know who you are. And I didn't want that to come from a test, or a rumor, or a stranger." Daniel nodded slowly, still digesting her words. "You're with someone else?" he asked, and Emma froze. "Yes," she said. "Jason. We've been together since before that night happened." She hated the way her voice shook, the way shame laced itself into every syllable. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes suddenly softer. "Does he know?" The question was a knife. She shook her head. "Not yet." And in that moment a strange thing happened. Daniel didn't explode, didn't accuse, didn't retreat. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "Then we need to be careful. For them." That sentence, simple as it was, shifted something in Emma. For the first time, she saw Daniel not as the past she regretted, but as someone tangled in the same fear and confusion she was. Someone who might, just might, care enough to face the truth too. The envelope arrived 3 days later, plain, clinical, and far too light for the weight it carried. Emma stared at it on the kitchen counter like it might explode. She hadn't told Jason she'd taken a paternity test. She hadn't told him anything. And now every second she waited to open it felt like betrayal layered on top of betrayal. She picked it up slowly, feeling its edges with trembling fingers, and then slid her thumb beneath the seal. The letter inside was only a few lines long, but her eyes locked immediately on the words that mattered. Results indicate a likelihood of separate paternity for each fetus. One fetus is consistent with the DNA of Mr. Daniel Reyes. The words blurred, but she read them again. And again. The truth was no longer theoretical. It had a name, a face, a future she hadn't planned. She placed the letter back in the envelope, folded the flap over carefully, and tucked it beneath a stack of magazines like she was burying a secret in plain sight. Her breath came short. The walls of the kitchen felt smaller than before. The floor beneath her seemed less stable. She sat, at the table, head in hands, unsure if she wanted to cry, scream, or disappear. She didn't have the luxury of emotion anymore. She had to think, to plan, to protect. Jason was in the garage working on the crib they'd bought last weekend. She could hear the gentle tap of wood against metal, the rhythm of someone preparing for a future he believed in, a future that wasn't real anymore. And yet, she loved him, not just for what he did, but for who he was when he didn't know she was watching. The man who talked to her belly when he thought she was asleep, who picked names out of books with childlike wonder, who kissed her forehead and said, "We're a team." She walked to the garage door and leaned against the frame, watching him in silence. He looked up and smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Almost done," he said. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she nodded and smiled and said, "It's perfect," then turned away, letter still burning in her pocket, and walked back into the house with a heart full of everything she hadn't said. Emma didn't sleep that night. The sound of Jason's breathing beside her was steady and peaceful, a cruel contrast to the storm inside her chest. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her fingers resting lightly on her stomach, as if trying to send a message to the twins. Maybe they could hear her thoughts. Maybe they already knew more than she could say. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined Jason's face if he ever found out. Would it crumble in disbelief? Would it harden in betrayal? Or worse, would he stay silent and leave slowly, piece by piece, like trust melting through her fingers? She tried to picture telling him. She rehearsed the words in her mind, rewrote the scenes again and again. But no version ended without breaking something sacred. She thought of Daniel, his voice over the phone, calm but unsure, his offer to do what's right. Though none of them knew what that meant. She didn't love him, that was clear. Whatever had happened that night, spontaneous, raw and regrettable. It wasn't love, it was a fracture in time, a decision made in loneliness and confusion. But the consequence of that moment was growing inside her now. Half her heart was wrapped around two futures she could barely hold together. She slipped out of bed quietly and walked to the nursery. It was only half finished. One crib, one mobile, one name written in cursive above the dresser. She ran her fingers along the wood. Jason had carved it by hand. Lily. They had only chosen one name, thinking they still had time for the second. But time was no longer something she had. Emma sat in the glider chair and closed her eyes. She remembered being 8 years old, sitting in her own mother's lap, listening to the promise every child wants to believe. No matter what happens, I'll always tell you the truth. And now here she was, mother, woman, partner, sitting in silence with a truth that could shatter the family she hadn't even built yet. She whispered to the empty room, "I don't know how to do this." But the room didn't answer. Only the quiet ticking of the clock reminded her that time would not wait for her to decide. The next morning, Emma woke up to the sound of Jason's making breakfast, whistling faintly, the smell of toast and eggs drifting down the hallway like some cruel reminder of normalcy. She stayed in bed longer than usual, her body heavy with the weight of pretending. But as she dragged herself out of the room, her heart sank. Jason was sitting at the table with the mail open in front of him. Her stomach turned cold. "Babe," he said, holding up an envelope. "You got something from the lab?" She froze. It was the same white envelope she had buried under the magazines. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket, but it was no longer there. Jason tilted his head. "Is it something serious?" Emma tried to speak, but her throat locked up. "It's nothing," she lied. "Just routine tests, pregnancy stuff." Jason didn't look convinced, but he smiled anyway and placed it gently back on the counter. "You scared me for a second. Thought it was something about the babies." The word babies echoed in her chest like thunder. She sat across from him, pretending to sip her tea, her mind racing. That envelope had nearly ended everything. One moment of distraction, and her carefully maintained illusion could have crumbled. And Jason, trusting, tender Jason, would never see it coming. She thought about telling him right there, about emptying the truth onto the table between the scrambled eggs and his morning paper. But her courage failed again. Instead, she asked him about the crib. He smiled, talked about painting the walls next weekend, about installing a nightlight shaped like a moon, about singing lullabies even if he couldn't carry a tune. And Emma smiled, nodded, added little comments like everything was fine. But inside, a countdown had begun. That envelope was a time bomb, and it was still ticking. After breakfast, she took it back and hid it properly this time, behind old tax documents in the hallway drawer, far from curious eyes. But she knew she couldn't hide forever. Secrets rot. And this one was already bleeding into every quiet moment, every word not spoken, every kiss that lingered just a little too long because she didn't know how many more she'd have. One truth, Emma thought, was about to cost her 2 lives. She just hadn't decided which one she was willing to lose. The call came in the middle of the night, Daniel's name lighting up her phone in a dim bedroom filled with silence. Emma hesitated before answering, her thumb hovering over the screen like it might burn her. Jason stirred beside her but didn't. "Wake!" She slipped into the hallway and whispered, "What is it?" Daniel's voice was shaky. "I know it's late. I'm sorry. But I've been thinking, I need to be involved." Emma leaned against the wall, pressing her free hand to her forehead. "Daniel, I told you, this changes everything." He exhaled. "I know, and I'm not trying to break your life apart, but I can't just vanish. I'm the father of one of them." The word hung in the air like a match about to touch gasoline. "I want to meet them," he added. "I want to be there when they're born." Emma closed her eyes. The image of Jason, painting nursery walls with a quiet hope, clashed violently with Daniel's voice on the other end of the line. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "He doesn't know. He still thinks they're both his." A long silence followed. Then Daniel spoke again, slower this time. "Emma, you're going to have to choose. Not between me and him. This isn't about love. It's about truth. And those kids, they'll grow up. They'll ask questions. One day, they'll want to know why you lied." That line sliced straight through her defenses. Emma had thought of that. What she'd tell them when they were old enough. How she'd explain the photographs, the timelines, the silence. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I'm still trying to hold everything together." Daniel's tone softened. "Sometimes things have to fall apart before they make sense." The call ended with no resolution. Just 2 people stranded on opposite cliffs of the same truth. Emma returned to bed, her heart thudding against her ribs like it wanted out. Jason murmured something in his sleep and pulled her closer. She curled into him, letting the lie live one more night. But in the morning, everything would shift. Daniel wasn't going to disappear, and Emma could feel time pressing in around her, demanding the reckoning she kept postponing. By sunrise, Emma was already dressed, pacing the living room with a mug of untouched coffee in hand. Every shadow on the wall looked like a question she couldn't answer. Her phone sat on the table, silent now, as if even it knew the storm had moved inward. She kept thinking about Daniel's words. "They'll ask why you lied." It wasn't just a hypothetical anymore. The closer she got to her due date, the more real everything became. She'd seen the twins on the sonogram. She'd watched them turn and kick, as if already taking sides. Jason emerged from the hallway rubbing his eyes, smiling when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, yawning. She shook her head and tried to smile. "Too much on my mind." He walked over and kissed her forehead, his hand resting gently on her belly. "They're gonna be here soon," he said with quiet awe. "2 perfect little girls." Emma's breath caught in her throat. He had picked 2 names. He had picked matching blankets. He had picked a future without knowing it was split in 2. She watched his face, studied every curve of trust and love that lived there, and wondered what it would look like twisted in betrayal. Could he forgive her? Could he still look at the children the same way if he knew one wasn't his? The thoughts spun fast and cruel. She remembered reading somewhere that grief isn't just about losing someone. It's about losing what you thought would be. And this lie, wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was robbing them all of peace, of real choice, of honesty. Jason sat down at the table, flipping through a baby magazine, humming to himself. Emma sat across from him, hands trembling. Her lips parted, and for a second she nearly said it. Everything. The night with Daniel. The envelope. The results. But fear, old and familiar, clamped down like a hand on her mouth. "I was thinking," she said instead, "we should talk to a counselor before the babies arrive. Just prepare for the transition." Jason looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Yeah? If that would help you, I'm in." Emma nodded, swallowing the truth again. Not because she wanted to, but because saying it out loud might shatter something too big to rebuild. Later that afternoon, Jason decided to organize the garage. A nesting instinct, he called it. Emma stayed inside, trying to distract herself with laundry and mindless scrolling, but her nerves refused to settle. It wasn't until she heard the dull thud of a cardboard box hitting the floor and Jason's surprised voice calling her name that she felt the shift. "Emma?" he said from the open garage. "Hey, what's this?" Her stomach dropped. She walked out slowly, each step heavy with dread. Jason was crouched near an old filing cabinet they hadn't touched since they moved in. In his hand was the edge of a manila folder she had completely forgotten about. A folder containing medical paperwork, duplicate lab forms, and a second copy of the DNA results. "I was looking for the toolbox," he said, laughing awkwardly. "But this had your name all over it." He handed her the folder, not suspecting anything. Not yet. Emma's hands shook as she took it, holding it too tightly. "It's nothing important," she said too quickly. "Old files from before the transfer clinic." Jason looked at her, puzzled. "You okay?" She nodded, heart racing. "Yeah, just hormonal. You know how it is." He smiled again, the way people do when they trust someone without question. He went back to his task, brushing dust off boxes and talking about installing new shelving. Emma stood there frozen, the folder still in her grip. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was inevitability. That folder should have been destroyed months ago. Now it sat in her hands like a loaded weapon, waiting to explode everything. She excused herself and went back inside, locking the bathroom door behind her. She sat on the edge of the tub, opened the folder and stared at the document she knew by heart. One line, one name, one match, and it wasn't Jason's. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it had absorbed the weight of every lie since the test was done. She knew what came next couldn't be delayed. Not by another sunrise. Jason's near discovery had turned the clock. She either had to speak or prepare for him to find out on his own, and that would be so much worse. The truth was coming. One way or another. The house was quiet that night, too quiet for a couple expecting twins. Emma sat in the nursery with the lights off, the glow of the moon painting soft shadows across the pastel walls. Two cribs stood side by side, dressed identically in colors Jason had picked. She ran her hand along one of the rails, feeling the curve of it like it was a question. Her heart ached from the silence, but she knew it wouldn't last. Jason was in the living room, the manila folder now sitting on the coffee table between them like a third presence. One that couldn't be ignored anymore. She had left it there on purpose. No more hiding. No more locking truth behind bathroom doors and fake smiles. When she returned to the living room, he was sitting stiffly, staring at the folder like it had started breathing. "Emma," he said, voice low, "what is this?" She sat across from him. "It's the truth I've been afraid to give you." He didn't touch the folder, just waited. She took a breath so deep it hurt. "One of the twins isn't yours." The air changed. Not with sound, but with absence. Jason didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. "It happened early on," she continued, voice breaking. "I didn't know it was possible, but it happened. And when I found out, I thought hiding it would protect you. Protect us." Jason finally looked down, exhaling like the air had been stolen from him. "So, who's the father?" She paused. "Daniel? That name, that man, that past, it was all here now, sitting between them in that folder. Jason stood slowly. "You were going to raise them both with me. Pretending?" "No," she said, standing too. "I wasn't pretending. I just didn't know how to explain a truth that would hurt you either way." Jason's eyes filled with something she couldn't name. Grief, betrayal, or just confusion. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me sooner?" She reached for him. "Because I didn't trust myself to survive losing you." The moment hung like a heartbeat suspended. Jason looked at her, then at the cribs behind her. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now," he whispered, "but I'm still here." And that, for now, was enough. Jason didn't speak for a long time after that. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter as if the world had tilted slightly and he was trying to stay upright. Emma sat on the couch, eyes fixed on the manila folder, now slightly open like it. Two had heard enough and no longer needed to be closed. The silence between them wasn't angry. It was wounded, raw in a way that demanded space, but begged for connection. Jason finally said, without looking at her, "You broke something, Emma?" She nodded, her voice quiet. "I know, but not the way you think," he added. "It's not just the betrayal. It's that I wasn't given the choice to love them both knowing the truth. You made that choice for me." That hit her harder than yelling ever could. Tears fell freely now. "You're right," she said. "I was so scared of your pain that I didn't let you decide how much of it you were willing to carry." Jason turned to face her. "I need time," he said, and she nodded again, already expecting it. "But I'm not walking out that door tonight. I want to understand what this means. For me, for them, for us." Emma exhaled deeply, a sound that carried both relief and devastation. "I want to fix this," she whispered. Jason walked slowly toward the cribs, standing between them. "They didn't ask for any of this," he said, "and I don't want either of them to grow up feeling like half a family." The tenderness in his voice cracked something open in her. He wasn't promising forever. He wasn't forgiving yet, but he wasn't retreating either. He was, in his own way, staying in the discomfort because love, real love, sometimes isn't about perfection. It's about showing up when everything breaks. Emma stood beside him, watching his hand rest gently on each crib, touching both futures at once. "They'll know you as their father," she said. Jason looked at her. "Then we'd better make sure we raise them with truth. No more secrets." And in that fragile moment, surrounded by cribs and consequences, they chose honesty, not as a fix, but as a beginning. Weeks passed, not as a clean slate, but as pages rewritten with trembling hands. Emma and Jason didn't pretend things had gone back to how they were. They rebuilt day by day, piece by piece. There were hard conversations, awkward silences, and nights where neither of them slept. But there were also small moments of healing. Jason feeling the twins kick for the first time. Emma catching him painting a mural on the nursery wall with two stars, side by side, connected by a ribbon of light. They attended a counseling session together, the kind that peels away the layers without mercy. Jason asked the questions he'd avoided. About Daniel. About the moment Emma knew. About the panic that led to silence. She answered honestly for the first time without trembling. Truth, once spoken, stopped being a weapon and started becoming a bridge. On the day the twins were born, the hospital room was filled with quiet anticipation, and then, suddenly, with life. Two cries, two souls, two tiny beings placed in their arms. One had Jason's eyes, the other didn't. And yet, when Jason looked down, he didn't see biology. He saw responsibility, love, a choice. He kissed each forehead and whispered the same thing to both. "You are mine, no matter what." Emma, watching him, realized that what had almost broken them had, in an unspoken way, redefined them. Love was no longer a promise, it was an action. a decision made in the fire and kept in the ash. That night at home, the four of them lay in the soft glow of a nightlight. Jason reached for Emma's hand. "We're not perfect," he said. "But maybe that's how we'll teach them what love really looks like." Emma smiled through her exhaustion, knowing she didn't deserve his grace but grateful for it anyway. The past had fractured them, but the future was theirs to rebuild. As the twins slept, unaware of the storm they'd been born into, Jason and Emma chose to stay, imperfect, scarred, but together. Because family, in the end, isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when the truth is hardest to hold, and holds it anyway.